Coming to you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America. A podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Ooley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 96 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, for Monday Gun Day, per usual, I have Mike Ooley back in the studio. Mike, welcome back.
Good morning.
Of course, if those of you who don't know, Mike is an attorney and a firearms instructor, as am I, and we're going to continue on a kind of a series of sorts from last week when we talked about body armor. We're going to talk about another piece of misunderstood equipment, another misunderstood tool for your right to bear arms and the right to self-defense, and that's the suppressor, or often called the silencer. There's a lot of propaganda about these sorts of items, the body armor and the suppressor, so we're going to continue with that theme this week, talking about the suppressor. But last week, we also ended with a bit of trivia. Mike, you want to say a little bit about that trivia question? Maybe repeat the question and talk
Sure.
about the answer?
Yeah, I think the question was, I'll read it. What is a perceptible delay in the ignition of a cartridge after the primer has been struck by the firing pin? Is it a misfire or a hang fire? You want to answer, or do you want me to answer the question?
Well, I know the answer. I think I'll go with hang fire.
That's right. It's a hang fire. It's a perceptible delay in the ignition of the cartridge. Now, why is that important? You think, oh, well, that really is super duper trivia. And it may be, but it's important for folks to know a hang fire is a perceptible delay. So when I press that trigger and I expect a bang, I get just a click, no bang. And there may be a delay of up to 30 seconds. So we generally, in a range environment in particular, we'll keep the firearm pointed in a safe direction to make sure that we don't have a hang fire before we go ahead and clear the stoppage. In other words, a misfire, it never fires. Hang fire, there's a delay. It may be 1 second, 5 seconds, 30 seconds. So we keep it pointed down range because it's obvious that if we start manipulating the firearm and it goes off, that could create a hazard for you. So anyway,
Mike, I have never seen a hang fire. Have you ever seen a hang fire?
Not in a civilian firearm.
Okay. Yeah. I said that several years ago about a squib load. I'd never seen a squib load, and about a year later, I saw one in a handgun. Hopefully, we don't have that same experience with hang fire.
You want to tell them what a squib load is? We just used a term that.
Yeah. So a squib load is a situation where, for whatever reason, there isn't enough pressure generated behind the bullet, so that the bullet actually gets lodged in. Sometimes will get lodged in the barrel of the gun. It could actually exit the gun, but not with ordinary velocity, or the velocity that it's designed to be projected at. But oftentimes, especially in rifles, they can get lodged in the barrel because the barrel is longer. But this actually, the one I saw actually occurred in a 3-inch short-barreled handgun, a compact handgun. So it was interesting that happened. But when it happened, I knew that it happened because I didn't feel much recoil. The bang wasn't very loud. I just saw a spark. It looked like maybe the primer had just gone off, and maybe I don't know if there was no powder in the cartridge case, or if there was just very little. But for whatever reason, it didn't ignite properly. The bullet separated from the case, got lodged in the barrel, which is dangerous. Because if you try to shoot another cartridge behind it, it will cause the gun to explode. So make sure, if you suspect a squib load has occurred, make sure that your barrel, of course, while observing all the rules for safe gun handling, make sure your barrel is clear of any obstruction.
Yeah, and you may there are ways that you can clear it yourself. For instance, maybe with a rod that's like a brass rod or a wooden dowel, something like that. Or you may need to get the help of a gunsmith or somebody that's competent to deal with those sorts of things. So make sure you do your due diligence on how to deal with those squib loads. But that is important to know the distinction between a misfire, hangfire, and squib, just for safety purposes.
Yeah, so I'm curious. We didn't actually talk about this off air, but I saw that Mr. Guns and Gear posted on Twitter, at least maybe on X, a video of an apparent hang fire where there's some conjecture about whether it was actually a hang fire or not, or whether it was a setup. But you can see in the video, he sets down, it's a rifle, he shoots it, nothing happens. He sets it down and then it goes off. And so the implication, right, is that it's a hang fire because there was a perceptible delay in the ignition sequence. So it was interesting. You read a bunch of the comments to the post, but I'd never seen one, and it looks like lots of other folks have never seen one either. If you read all the comments, so if I remember, I'll post a link to that video in the show notes. But with that, did you see that video, Mike?
No, I didn't see the video, okay. So I'll look at your link when you put it on, because I haven't seen the video.
It was just coincidence. I think I saw that video a few days before we recorded the episode with the trivia question. So it was just coincidence, I think, that you picked out that piece of trivia.
Sure.
Yeah. But anyway, so let's...
You want to do another trivia thing for next week?
We'll hang at the end, yeah.
All right, to the end. Okay.
We'll dangle that one at the end.
Let me know, because I'll forget.
Yeah. All right. Well, so without all that said, Mike, let's get into the topic for today. What people need to know about suppressors, right? And some of the propaganda, clear up some of the propaganda, why these are useful tools, what they are, how to properly possess one, etc.
Yeah. And once again, the impetus with this, much like last week's episode regarding body armor, is that so many times people get their information about body armor or suppressors today, silencers we're going to talk about, and we'll get that squared away here in just a minute, silencers versus suppressors, but they get their information from Hollywood or the media, which generally, in my estimation and opinion, is wholly uninformed about firearms generally, and certainly these ancillary devices. So we wanted to put some information out there. You may already know all of this. If you do, maybe it'll just jog something in your mind. So when you talk to family, friends, colleagues, whatever, you'll have some information to talk to them about with respect to these suppressors and silencers. And I think what we'll do is first start with that term, suppressor or silencer. Technically speaking, they're silencers because the inventor of at least the American inventor, I think the first person that invented and patented one here in the United States was Hiram Maxim, and he called it a silencer. It was patented in 1909. Now, he also was the inventor of car mufflers. So these work in a similar sort of way, except a car muffler, as you probably know, or many of your listeners know, the air volume actually goes through a series of baffles or chambers, but they're not necessarily in a straight line. Obviously, in a muffler, the gases don't have to go in a straight line to be expelled.
There's no projectile going through a muffler, just hot gases.
Yeah, but he called it a silencer. Technically, it's a silencer, but that's probably not the best description of it because it doesn't silence anything. That's one of the myths that we see in Hollywood or in the press. It simply suppresses the volume of sound, the retort of a firearm and the cartridge. So I generally will use the term suppressor. I understand that that's probably legally incorrect, but I think it's more an accurate description of the device. And like I said, Hiram Maxim made car mufflers as well. These were made along about the same time at the beginning of the 20th century.
And for a while, you would see people on YouTube try to retrofit, and don't do this because you could get in trouble with the ATF potentially, but you would see people retrofit car mufflers to make suppressors for their firearms. I mean, it does work to some degree, but it's not a good idea.
Yeah, and I mean the general.
I'm sorry, I said car mufflers, oil filters. They would retrofit to make into a suppressor for their firearm.
Yeah, and you can get in a lot of trouble by things you do on YouTube, so don't be doing that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we'll move on and talk about this. I mean, I think a suppressor is a safety device. And we'll talk about that here. But I want to give one other little caveat, and that is what we're talking about suppressors here, sort of at the 50,000 foot view. And you mentioned what some people do on YouTube with oil filters and things like that. Make sure you do your own due diligence here. We're attorneys, but we're not giving you, because this area is can be rather technical and tedious in terms of legal requirements. So make sure you do your own due diligence. What we're giving you here is hopefully a little bit of education that you can, maybe you already know it, but you can at least be reminded and pass it on to other folks. So this is educational and shouldn't be construed as legal advice. With that said, once again, I think the suppressor is a safety device. It reduces hearing loss or damage to your ears if you shoot a lot. Some suppressors, firearm combos, and once again, I'm not an OSHA expert or an expert in the amount of decibels your ear can take in one instance or over time, but I think they can make some firearms hearing safe to use. In other words, you don't necessarily have to use hearing protection. Once again, do your own due diligence. But I think it's possible that they can do that. They certainly can reduce the volume. And from my standpoint, that's nicer for your neighbors. If you live in an area where you can shoot in your own property, it does reduce the retort and the volume of firearms.
And that whether the suppressor is going to get the volume down to a hearing safe level, right, is going to depend a lot on the suppressor itself, because there are lots of different types of suppressors, and then also on the firearm and the caliber of the firearm itself, and the mechanism of the firearm, because whether it's a semi-automatic or a bolt can make some difference as well.
Absolutely. And then whether the ammunition, which we'll talk about in a bit, whether the ammunition is supersonic or subsonic, is going to have a great deal of to do with whether or not it could be brought down to the hearing safe levels.
But in any case, they're designed to reduce the sound, the decibel level of the explosion that you hear when the hot gases exit the muzzle.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll hear these things referred to as cans. Just a little description. They essentially are a small, help me with the word, cylindrical metal, some sort of metal like can that goes on the end. They may be, I don't know, an inch in diameter or a little more, that sort of thing. They may be just 3 or 4 inches up to 8 or 9, maybe even longer. But it's like a little metal piece that goes on the end of the firearm. They can weigh just very few ounces to, over a pound.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what we're talking about here. And what these things do, not only do they reduce the noise, but they'll reduce the recoil. They may make your firearm a little easier to shoot and less intimidating, particularly for new shooters. But they will make it a little bit heavier. They also can facilitate better communications between people that are shooting together, whether it's just in a training environment, a range environment, or even in a tactical situation. It's my understanding and preparation for this that even the Marine Corps now is starting to field suppressors for the force at large, not just special units, but they're actually going to start using it because it facilitates a couple of things. Number one, I mean, in the military, you always talk about shoot, move, and communicate. It allows communication at the squad level, or in particular, or between individual soldiers or Marines. So I think they're looking at adopting those. And also, I think one of the biggest problems that the Veterans Administration has faced is hearing loss in soldiers. So anyway, you see them, I think you're going to see them in more widespread use in the military. And sometimes when you see them in widespread use in the military, you see them used more in the civilian context as well.
So these are, there are lots of benefits to suppressors.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned hunting, you mentioned being courteous to your neighbors, you mentioned the military application, the safety application, for hearing preservation. And in fact, there was a bill that got quite a bit of traction during the first 2 years of the Trump presidency called the Hearing Protection Act, which ultimately did not get passed. But that was the idea behind the bill, right? The Hearing Protection Act was that these are safety devices. They're not these nefarious devices portrayed by Hollywood and by gun grabbers, that are just used in crime. In fact, they're used in almost no crime. So these,
I couldn't find any crime in the last 10, but I'm not subject to correction, but amazingly, 0.
Yeah. And it's not like nobody has these. I mean, these are widely owned by the gun community, especially, in the last decade or so. They've really proliferated. At least that's my impression.
Yeah, I mean, once again, I mean, I think there are lots of upsides to these things. It's a safety device. It might increase your awareness in a situation where you have to use a firearm. But, interestingly enough, I'll go back to the malum in se and malum prohibitum. The only time these are used are involved in a crime is because somehow the government wants to go after people because they own these safety devices. That's usually when they're involved in a crime, or that's when the only time they're involved in a crime,
right?
Because the government obviously wants to maintain a monopoly on force or the exercise of force to the extent they can.
People get in trouble with these not because they've committed real crime by harming somebody. They've committed a crime because they haven't complied with the government tax or the government regulation with respect to suppressors. Right. So these are, like you said, these are safety devices. And in fact, we talked a little bit about the National Firearms Act before, but these are regulated, heavily regulated under the National Firearms Act of 1934. And the impression that you get, we talk about Hollywood, we talk about the gun control media. The impression that you get is that these are used by criminals so that they can shoot somebody or commit a crime and nobody knows, like because it's silenced, right? But the firearm is generally still quite loud, even with a suppressor on it. So it's not like you can shoot these things and there's no sound.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example. This is just my opinion based upon my use. People may go out and say you don't understand what you're talking about in terms of the decibel levels, but like an AR-15, 5.56, you shoot it very loud. You put the suppressor on it that I've had experience with. It seems like it takes an AR-15 down so that it sounds about like a 22 caliber rimfire rifle to me, or maybe a little less.
Yeah, with an unsuppressed 22 caliber rifle sounds about like, just from our anecdotal experience, like an AR-15 that's suppressed.
Now, so that's not silenced at all,
right?
But that's a supersonic round, and on the other hand, if you shoot one out of a 22 caliber pistol, subsonic ammo, it's very quiet. It's going to be something closer to an air pistol,
but still not silent.
But still not silent at all. It's going to be much. It's going to be very quiet, but not silent.
Yeah.
So anyway, but just one thing before we can talk a little bit about who can purchase one of these, because one of the biggest lessons here, I think, is that with respect to a suppressor, you need to make sure you comply with the government regulations when you get one of those, so that you don't run afoul of one of these.
Malum in se versus malum prohibitum.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So this is a malum prohibitum. We've talked about before. I should just explain here real quickly. Malum prohibitum are laws that prohibit, or there are actions that are wrong just because they are prohibited by law. There's nothing inherently wrong with them. Versus malum in se are things that are wrong in themselves, like murder, like robbery, like rape. Morally wrong. So whereas possessing a suppressor unregistered and not having paid a tax, there is nothing morally wrong with that, but it's against the law. Okay, it's not non-compliant with the National Firearms Act.
Yeah, and what's interesting, I'll mention this now. It's my understanding, based on some limited research, that interestingly enough, the Europeans are generally much more pro-regulation when it comes to an actual firearm itself. But there are at least some, if not many, European countries who are very much less regulatory. I don't know if that's an adjective or not. Less regulatory when it comes to suppressors than we are here in the United States.
Yeah.
So
because they're safety devices.
Yeah. And by the way, the lawyer coming out in a minute, we talked about hunting earlier. Make sure that you pay attention. We'll talk about it again. You may or may not be able to hunt with a silencer depending on your state.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So some of the downsides, though, I mean, they do cost a considerable amount of money. A suppressor, I mean, something for a 22 handgun, for instance, you may be able, and these are very vague general numbers, you may be able to buy something that's $250. Okay. Something in that category or more. But if you get to something with larger caliber, rifle rated, or, that sort of thing, I mean, you could spend $1,500, $1,800 on the suppressor itself. And then you got to pay a tax, which we'll get back to, the $200 tax. And then you may need to purchase some sort of muzzle device to help you or to provide for the attachment of the suppressor to the firearm. So, I mean, you can spend a lot of money on these things, and that's a downside. They also, you're going to have firearms that have threaded barrels already, or you have to get them threaded. Most manufacturers now are providing a lot more threaded barrels than they used to because of the prevalence and the popularity of suppressors over the last several years. But they do add length and weight to your firearms, which can make them a little bit cumbersome. And you'll have to take, that's a downside. You'll have to think about that when you think about mounting a suppressor to which firearm. There's going to be a question about what firearms are best appropriate or could best utilize a suppressor. And it also is going to make your firearm probably a little dirtier, a little faster. And some firearms have difficulty in even functioning correctly with the suppressor, because what the suppressor does is it cools and changes how the muzzle blast exits the barrel. It goes through these baffles. It basically changes the duration of how those gases exit the muzzle, the barrel, and that can have an impact on how the firearm functions. So, for instance, with an AR-15, you may have to, depending on the firearm, some are great right out of the box, but some people have to mess with gas blocks or buffers, mostly buffers, not buffer springs. But anyway, those are some potential downsides that you have to think about and do some research regarding your particular situation and maybe the firearms you have and the firearms you might want to purchase in the future. So
those are some of the downsides, which are considerable, but there's still a huge advantage, obviously, because it reduces the sound. But if people decide they want to purchase one, who can purchase one? You want to talk a little bit about that, Mike?
Yeah, it's in some ways it's like just purchasing a firearm. If you're going to purchase one from an FFL, you're going to have to be 21 years old, depending on your state. You may be okay at 18 to purchase one privately or to be the beneficiary of a trust or a part of a corporation, but it's sort of the same sort of rule in terms of ages when you compare it to firearms purchases. Of course, you're going to be a U.S. citizen. You're going to have to be legally able to buy a firearm. The same disqualifiers that apply to a firearm are going to apply to a suppressor or a silencer. You're going to have to pass that background check, and you're going to have to pay a $200 transfer tax. And that transfer tax is a transfer tax. So, you have to pay it when you purchase it. And then if you ever transfer the firearm, somebody's going to have to pay another $200 tax.
Yeah.
Now, we're not going to go into the law of 50 states, but it's my understanding that the vast majority of states, with probably only single digits of states, like 8 is what I've read. Understand, I didn't look up the law in 50 states, but only a few states will allow you, I shouldn't say allow you, will preclude you from having a suppressor. Those states include the usual culprits when it comes to regulatory regulations and firearms. That's Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, DC, those sorts of states. So anyway, keep that in mind and make sure you check out what's going on in your state before you commit to this sort of purchase.
You talked about a few things there that I think are interesting and may change in the coming years. We'll see what the courts do. But number one, you mentioned that to purchase one from an FFL, you have to be 21 years of age. That's something that's being litigated in the courts right now because clearly, in my opinion, people 18 to 21 years of age are included in the people under the Second Amendment. Okay. So there doesn't seem to be any historical basis under the Bruin methodology to preclude people between the ages of 18 and 20 from purchasing a firearm or an arm such as a suppressor, right? Because the Second Amendment is not just about firearms; it's about arms that are commonly used for lawful purposes. So
let's assume that you're a United States citizen who wants to purchase a suppressor for lawful purposes, and you generally can purchase a firearm and you're qualified to purchase a suppressor. I think we ought to talk a little bit about the hoops you got to jump through, and then maybe you can address whether those hoops are constitutional or not.
Right. And there's a few issues there, so we'll address those here shortly. So let's, like you said, Mike, let's talk about the hoops. What are the hoops that people have to go through to purchase a suppressor?
Well, I think you mentioned earlier the NFA, that stands for the National Firearms Act, which was passed in 1934. And I'm going to ask you in a few minutes whether you think that's constitutional or not. But here's what it requires you to do at this juncture. Like I said, it was passed in 1934, and you got to remember what was going on in this country: the Great Depression. And you had lots of gang activity. You had Al Capone, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Bonnie and Clyde, yada yada yada. People know what was going on in this country during that time with prohibition, another subject, which was an absolute failure.
It still is.
But anyway, it still is. Some things don't change. But anyway, what had to happen? Something, just like today, the politicians had to do something about all of this. That's how they keep power. So they have to come out with some propaganda and do something. So what did they do? They passed the National Firearms Act, which is interestingly in the tax code. I think at the time, most politicians and most people thought that they couldn't just outright prohibit this stuff. So, what'd they do? They decided to pass a tax, which in 1934 was $200. It's the same today. And that was made it practically a prohibition to most people, so that most people could not buy these firearms and submit themselves to the requirements of the NFA and pay these taxes. And of course, like most gun regulations, these regulations weren't going to have any impact on Al Capone or John Dillinger.
Yeah, and guess who could pay the tax? Probably the gangsters.
But
guess who wasn't going to pay it anyway? The gangsters.
Yeah.
So this was a complete nothing. I mean, all it did was serve to prohibit good people from arming themselves with useful safety devices.
Yeah. So this NFA has existed since 1934, and we still have it today. Now, what the NFA regulates, we're just talking about suppressors or silencers today, but just an FYI, and no way we can get into all these things today, but it regulates machine guns, and there was an act passed in 1986 that makes it illegal for private citizens to purchase new machine guns. You can still jump through some hoops and maybe purchase a pre-1986 machine gun, but we won't talk about that today. It also regulates the NFA, that is short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, destructive devices, and lots of other things. So, but we're going to concentrate on the suppressor silencer subject today, and that's what. So you're going to have to jump through the NFA hoops, which is going to require you to pay a tax and register. A lot of people ask us, "Hey, do I have to register this firearm that I inherited or whatever?" There's really no registration for, quote, the typical firearm that most people have. But this area, when it comes to, short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, and suppressors, there is a national registration requirement that the ATF oversees.
Yeah. And I've talked more about the National Firearms Act of 1934 in the episode I did about the Second Amendment, because this National Firearms Act was really one of the first, if not the first, piece of gun control legislation at the federal level.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times I like to say, and because I think it's true, that prohibition was the reason for the impetus behind the first gun control measure at the federal level. Lots of people talk about earlier forms of gun control around the time of Reconstruction after the Civil War that had sort of racist elements, but that was at the state level. At the federal level, this National Firearms Act is really the first piece of gun control legislation.
Yeah. So if you want to buy interested in a suppressor or silencer, find a dealer that is authorized. Once again, there are certain dealers that can sell these and certain ones that can't. Find a dealer that has lots of experience or someone that sells these in volume, and they'll take you through the process. You'll have to purchase the firearm. Like I said, there'll be a $200 tax. There'll be a background check. There'll be lots of paperwork that needs to be filled out. It will be sent to the ATF, and then wait times vary, but probably 6-7 months later, you'll get an approval. And you actually get your stamp. They stamp your paperwork with a little stamp, and you'll get that back. And then your dealer will then be able to transfer the firearm to you because the government has blessed the transfer.
Yeah. So you actually get this tax stamp, and you're required to keep that tax stamp with the regulated item at all times. So that includes whether it's the suppressor or any of these other items that you've mentioned, the short-barreled rifle, short-barreled shotgun, machine gun, or destructive device of some sort. You have to keep the tax stamp with that device at all times.
Yep, exactly. So let's talk about some other things about what people may want to also consider when they shop for a suppressor or silencer. But the real question is that I'd like for you to address a little bit here is the NFA. Is it constitutional? Will it survive analysis under the Bruin decision that currently provides the framework we use to determine whether government action is constitutional pursuant to the Second Amendment?
So just before I touch on that, I will save this for another episode, but let us know if you'd like us to talk about it more. But you can buy these NFA items as an individual, or you can sometimes buy them as a trust, which was popular for a long time.
It still is.
And still is, but it lost some of its luster with some changes back during the Obama administration. But still beneficial for lots of reasons, and we're happy to talk about that in a future episode, maybe about the benefits of an NFA trust, what's sometimes called an NFA trust or a gun trust. But I think NFA trust is and we'll talk about that more, because I think a gun trust is more applicable for people who want to put non-NFA items in it, and there are reasons to do that. And then there, I think, are benefits to having just an NFA trust for NFA items, because remember, they're registered with the government. So we like to create some separation there. But
yeah, and that's a whole nother subject, the gun trust thing. I think it's a good idea, or at least it's a very good idea for people to consider that as even today, like you said, it's a little bit less popular because of government regs, but something they ought to consider anyway.
Yeah, but we can get into more depth in that in a separate episode. But with respect to the constitutionality of the NFA, remember, like you were saying, Mike, that this was passed on the heels of Prohibition because of violence between rival gangs. You mentioned the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. There was a conflict between the gangs from Al Capone and Bugs Moran in Chicago. They used Thompson submachine guns, and there was this push in the aftermath of that conflict to regulate firearms, including handguns, by the way, not just these items that ultimately became NFA items. But like you said, up till 1934, it was assumed that the federal government had no ability to regulate firearms, to infringe in any way on the right to keep and bear arms. Because remember, the Second Amendment, it protects a pre-existing right to self-defense. It says a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay, it doesn't get much clearer than that. But lots of people really put a ton of emphasis on that, what's called prefatory clause, a well-regulated militia. And we know from Heller and from a lot of the founding documents that prefatory clause was just that, a prefatory clause. It didn't limit the right in any way. It just simply stated a reason for the protection of that right, a reason among many reasons. It was just a reason. You could say, for instance, with the First Amendment, the need for a well-educated populace, the right of the people to keep and read books shall not be infringed. I mean, there's lots of other reasons for keeping and reading books other than having a well-educated populace, but that would be a reason, right? So that's really the function that the prefatory clause serves.
And it's water under the bridge now, that this argument about the collectivist right versus an individual right.
Right. So in Heller, the court, which was the case from 2008, heard a case out of Washington, D.C., which was a federal enclave. And in that case, they determined that the Second Amendment protected an individual right, not a collective right that had something to do with service in the militia. But remember, 1934, the NFA passes as a tax and a registration requirement on these items. And the court actually hears a case, United States versus Miller, that challenged the constitutionality of the NFA. And this Miller case was from the late 1930s, so just a few years after the NFA passed. And it involved a man, Miller, who was charged with violation of NFA for transporting a short-barreled shotgun across state lines. And one of the challenges he brought to his case, or one of the defenses he brought, was that the NFA was unconstitutional. Well, while his case was being litigated, he was released from prison, and he had just testified against a lot of his gangster cohorts who had been involved in various bank robberies. And he was ultimately shot to death while the case was pending. So by the time the case got to the Supreme Court, the guy who brought the case was dead. So there was very little defense put on. He wasn't even present for Supreme Court oral argument. He wasn't present to make the requisite briefing to defend his case. And the court, in this really vague opinion, ultimately upheld the constitutionality of the National Firearms Act of 1934. But that opinion, like I said, it was a vague opinion, and it has been used for decades since to support both sides of the argument about whether or not the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right or a collective right. And that remained the case until Heller in 2008, which said that it's an individual right. It has nothing to do with service in the militia. It's an individual right, and one of the reasons for that right was so that there would be a militia ready and able to be called if necessary. Okay. So, with that said, let's get back to our question: is the NFA constitutional? Well, this Miller case from the late 1930s said that it was. But now we have some clarification from the Supreme Court about what sort of standard laws should be held to that implicate the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. And we know this methodology from the Bruin case. In Bruin, the court said we don't get into interest balancing. We don't apply these levels of scrutiny that we've heard about for so long. There's no rational basis test. There's no intermediate scrutiny test. There's no strict scrutiny test even. All we need to do is look at the text, history, and tradition of the Second Amendment. So if a law implicates or infringes in some way on the right to keep and bear arms, does that infringement meet this text, history, and tradition analysis? And to do that, we have to look at history to see if at the time of the founding there was some historical analog that would support the current law that's infringing on that right. So I think clearly if you look at the NFA from 1934, a $200 tax on certain types of arms, there is no historical analog that would support the constitutionality of that limitation, of that restriction. Now, some of these nuances are being vetted by the courts. They're trying to carve out what sorts of analogies are proper. How close does the analogy have to be? They've said it doesn't have to be a historical twin, but how close does it have to be? And that's something that the court is trying to sort out right now with the Rahimi case, and then with some other cases that are coming before the court. But clearly, in my opinion, I think that all federal gun control is unconstitutional. I think the courts won't say that, but I think the NFA is clearly unconstitutional.
So there's hope that the courts may determine that the NFA is unconstitutional, and therefore someday we'll be able to go and buy these safety devices, much like some Europeans get to do today. And that is the restrictions are no more than they are to buy a firearm.
I think you should be able to buy them out of a Sears catalog like you used to be able to buy a firearm, but at the very least, we should be able to purchase them like we buy any other firearm.
Yep.
Yeah.
And once again, too, I mean, think about this. I couldn't find any instance in the last 10 years or so where they were used in a crime.
Yeah.
So, except the crimes against the government regs about who can possess one and when you have to transfer, the transfer rules, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And remember, we talked about the popularity of suppressors. So even though these are highly regulated arms, in short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns fall into this category as well. I think they meet what's also called the common use test, which is important to point out too in terms of the constitutional analysis. The court in Heller said that those arms that are in common use for lawful purposes are arms that are protected by the Second Amendment. And I think clearly that suppressors fit that definition. They are arms in common use for lawful purposes by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And we know from Caetano, which analyzed the common use, tasers under the common use analysis, which there were, I think, a few 100,000 of those, said that tasers or stun guns meet the definition of an arm in common use. So I think clearly suppressors would as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any stats, but I would submit to you that suppressors are used much more commonly than stun guns.
Now, with that said, I think the NFA is clearly unconstitutional. What do I think the court will do with it? That's a totally different question. Obviously, I thought, for instance, this is a somewhat similar case, the Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act case, which compelled people to purchase health insurance. The Congress said again and again, this is not a tax, this is not a tax, this is not a tax, because that's what they thought they had to do to get it passed, the legislature. And the court said, oh, no, it's a tax and you can do that. So who knows what sort of logical leaps and bounds the court will, or illogical leaps and bounds the court will make to uphold this tax. They may do something to say that that this tax is constitutional in some way, but I think it will be clearly, I think, in opposition to the true meaning of the Constitution, the Second Amendment, and we'll, like you were getting ready to say, Mike,
it'll take mental gymnastics
to uphold it.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things we're doing here today is encourage people to think about purchasing one of these, and that'll make them even more common.
Yeah.
Maybe we should talk about leave the legal a little bit and talk about some of the more practical things. If somebody is interested in buying one, things they may want to think about.
Sure. Yeah.
First of all, keep in mind it's going to take you 6 or 7 months probably for this to be approved by the ATF after you make a purchasing decision and submit your paperwork. And by the way, your dealer will help you do that. You're not going to, you could, but you're not going to be on your own in all likelihood with regard to the submission of this stuff. Somebody will take you through it. And there are companies out there that have done a phenomenal job in terms of streamlining this cumbersome bureaucratic mess. Anyway, so do your research. This is not something like a vest that you can buy at Walmart. It doesn't fit and you take it back. So make sure you get it right. Do your research. First of all, it's going to have to attach to your barrel. You're going to have to make a decision about whether you want, so your barrel is going to have to be threaded. People know what threads are, like a bolt. There'll be external threads on your barrel. You're going to have to decide whether you want to attach that suppressor directly to those threads. In other words, it just screws in, or whether you're going to have a muzzle device between your barrel and the suppressor. Now, a muzzle device serves a couple of functions, well, more than that probably, but it allows you to attach, they're made specifically for the suppressor, and they allow you to attach the suppressor very quickly. It'll also allow the repeated mounting of that suppressor so that you don't get a shift in your point of impact. In other words, the bullet, if you're aiming, the bullet hits a different spot after you dismount the suppressor. So you'll have to make that decision. I mean, personally, in my opinion, you're better off if you get some sort of muzzle device. I happen to use the Surefire stuff for the most part. Now, that's not necessarily the case with regard to a pistol, but that's something that you're going to have to decide. And once you commit to a particular muzzle device, I mean, you're only going to be able to use that manufacturer's suppressors for the most part.
Yeah, they're ordinarily proprietary muzzle devices that only work with. So if you have a Surefire muzzle device, it's only going to work with Surefire suppressor or a SIG or whatever.
Yeah, SIG, whatever manufacturer. But that muzzle device also provides, if you're not using the suppressor, can provide the same benefits that a typical, like a bird cage on an AR-15 provides, the muzzle device on the end of the barrel. It'll suppress the flash some, and it protects the end of the barrel because no matter what you do, if you have a threaded barrel, you don't want to leave those threads exposed. And when you're not using a suppressor, if it doesn't have a muzzle device, you're going to want some sort of thread protector on the muzzle. So that's something to think about. I mean, which way are you going to go? Another thing that you want to think about is not only, how many decibels this suppressor suppresses, but you're going to want to think about other things too, like how easy is the suppressor going to be to take on and off? Is it going to shift my point of impact with regard to the bullets? Is it how durable is it? Suppressor also reduces muzzle flash and signature. Some suppressors might, for instance, do better in terms of suppressing sound by a decibel or two, but not suppress muzzle flash as much. How much blowback does the suppressor create for your particular firearm? A firearm that does an incredibly A+ job with sound suppression may create an excessive amount of blowback that you're not comfortable with.
Or let's think about, just for an example here, let's give an example with an AR-15. So an AR-15 generally will shoot a 5.56 or a 2.23 round. And you can buy a suppressor that is made for 5.56 or 2.23. Mm-hmm. Somebody might say, well, I want it to also work on my 30 caliber rifle, mm-hmm. right? So they may say, I want a suppressor that does both. I want it to go on my 30-06 and on my AR-15. Right. But mm-hmm. what's the compromise there? Why would somebody do that or not do that?
Well, one example, for instance, you generally, once again, I'm not an engineer, do your own advice, do your own research. But if you buy a suppressor that will work on a 30 caliber rifle, like a 30-06 or a 308, for instance, or a 300 blackout, well, that's not a 30, but what happens is it'll work on that 30 caliber rifle. It'll be a little bit bigger. Obviously, the bore will have to be bigger to allow a 30 caliber round to go through it. It'll be heavier generally, but you can put it on like an AR-15 because the caliber, the bore diameter is smaller. So that smaller bullet from the AR-15 will actually travel through the suppressor. Now, the downside is you're putting a suppressor on there that's been optimized for the 30 caliber round. It's probably a little bigger, a little longer. And because the bore diameter of the suppressor itself has to be larger, the sound suppression will not be as much in the AR-15 as it would be with a suppressor that was particularly manufactured for the 5.56 round.
Yeah, because
Did I answer that?
I think so. But so the 5.56, you may be able to buy a 30 caliber suppressor or a suppressor made for a 30 caliber firearm, but because the hole for the diameter of the hole for the projectile for the bullet is larger, it's not going to suppress a smaller bullet as well.
And
right?
generally a 30 caliber suppressor is going to be larger and heavier.
Right. So there are compromises that you make by taking the one size fits all approach.
And you could do the same with a handgun. I mean, check with your manufacturers, but a suppressor that you could use on a 45 caliber handgun could be used on a 9mm handgun, because a 9mm is 0.38. It's actually a smaller diameter than the 45. So it would work. Would it work as well as one designed specifically just for the 9mm? Probably not.
Yeah. But under no circumstance can you use the suppressor designed for a smaller caliber on a larger caliber, right?
Correct.
Because it will hit the baffle. You'll get a significant baffle strike. It will destroy the suppressor. Yeah, and create a safety issue.
Yeah, and by the way, that's baffle strikes is where the bullet passes from the barrel of the firearm into the suppressor, and if the threading is not done perfectly concentric, you can have some issues. So it's why it's important to buy suppressors from, I think, major manufacturers that attach precisely to the host firearm.
Well, this is even more of a consideration when you're getting a barrel threaded that was not threaded from the manufacturer, right? So if I have a bolt action rifle and I want to get it threaded so that I can put a suppressor on it, and I take it to a gunsmith to get it threaded, if it's not threaded properly, the angle that the suppressor attaches at could be wrong, so that when the projectile comes through, it strikes the the baffle,
which is not good. Could create, obviously, can destroy property. Your suppressor, which is very expensive, and you've gone through a great deal of effort and time to get, but it also could cause personal injury.
Yeah.
So anyway, something to keep in mind. When you research these things, you're also going to research the material they're made out of, how heavy they are, how long they are. Once again, there's a plus and a minus. The length of the suppressor may, in fact, reduce the sound signature just a little bit more than a shorter one. But what are you giving up? You're adding extra length to your rifle or your pistol. So those are all things that you need to consider. Along with another thing I might mention is whether you're going to be shooting subsonic or sonic or supersonic ammo. There are certain calibers that are, first of all, what I'm talking about there, the speed of sound is about 1,100 or 1,125 feet per second at sea level. And it changes based upon your altitude and that sort of thing. But cartridges that are traditionally more slow moving, like a 45 caliber, for instance, are generally going to be below
the speed of sound.
Yeah. So you're not going to get this sonic pop or sonic noise that you would get with other calibers like a 5.56 or even a 9mm can be supersonic in many instances. So that's why we have what's called a 300 blackout, because it's based upon the 5.56 cartridge, but it's a larger bullet that moves slower below the speed of sound. So the suppressor is more effective in making the overall experience of using the firearm quieter.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of that made any sense. In other words, you're not going to get, if you're using supersonic ammo, you're probably not going to get hearing safe levels. Subsonic ammo, you might get hearing safe. And you might say, oh, well, I'll just buy subsonic ammo. Well, then
you're losing ballistic.
Performance. For instance, a 308 rifle is great, supersonic, but if you bring it down to the level of a subsonic cartridge or a subsonic level, your ballistic performance is going to be far, far, far short of the performance at the supersonic level.
Yeah, and the other thing too, I'm thinking about AR-15s quite a bit here, because their suppressors are popular with all sorts of rifles, but they're popular with AR-15 as well. The level of sound suppression is not necessarily the only consideration here. I mean, you've talked about durability, you've talked about weight and length and all sorts of things. Flash. But sometimes and I'm thinking about the AR-15 as an example because it's a semi-automatic, you talk about blowback. Sometimes the more suppression there is, the more blowback you get, right? So that means when the bolt actuates in the AR-15, you get more gases escaping through the rear toward the end user, right? You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, just a couple of things there. Number one, I mean, what that can cause is it gets in your face.
Mm-hmm.
You feel those exhaust gases in your face when you shoot the firearm. And some people buy charging handles for the AR-15. You know what that is? We can talk about that some other time. But they buy charging handles that are specifically designed to address this blowback so it doesn't come back in the shooter's face. But more importantly, I think it also can affect the function or reliability of your firearm. In particular, I think at the lower end of the AR-15 spectrum, a lot of manufacturers make their guns so they're what we say is they're overgassed. That is, they're getting probably from the factory too much gas back to the bolt in terms of force to cycle the bolt. And the reason they do that in their defense is they don't know what their customers are going to use in terms of ammo. Some folks may use very weak ammo, very dirty, there's no telling what people will use in terms of ammo. And they want to make sure that gun functions. So they overgas it for that weaker stuff. Okay. And what that does is that increases bolt velocity, which in turn can have an impact on the reliability, the ejection of cement cases, that sort of thing. So I guess what I'm saying.
But there are things you can do to compensate for that, right?
Well, you can if you want to mess with your firearm, gas blocks, the charging handle. So I guess what I'm saying is maybe do your research, buy a higher quality firearm or a higher quality suppressor that has an ability not to affect the cycling of the firearm as much.
Well, and some people get what's called an adjustable gas block too, right? To regulate the flow of gas.
Yeah, and of course that introduces additional potential problems or failure points in a firearm.
Yeah. So there are lots of considerations here. It's not something that you just say, oh, that one suppresses the most, I'm going to attach it to my rifle and I'm going to be good. There are lots of considerations to think about.
And I'm going to say this, and I hope I don't offend anybody, but generally speaking, if you spend more money on there are some manufacturers that I think just produce a higher quality AR-15. And the kind of the budget stuff is probably going to be less likely to function reliably with a suppressor than a higher quality AR-15.
Yeah. Okay. Well, obviously we can't get into all the nuances. It's different for every firearm, different for every suppressor, but there are compromises that people have to make when they decide what sort of suppressor they want to use on their firearm. So what else should we talk about here? I mean, we talked about, how you take it on and off, the flash suppression, the amount of suppression that it does for sound, the blowback, the durability, the difference between subsonic and supersonic, point of impact shift, weight, length, size, etc. What else should people be thinking about when they're purchasing a suppressor?
Well, I mean, I think they did, once again, this is the do your homework thing. Get online, do the research there. Be careful, who you listen to on YouTube or the internet. Of course, what you're hearing here is okay. But anyway, watch what you hear.
Check what we say too. Really,
check what we say, and even be careful at your dealer. Get multiple opinions on a particular. If you narrow it down to 4 or 5 different kinds of different suppressors, get 4 or 5 different opinions from different gun shops. Also, if you can talk to somebody that owns one, they can tell you about their experience. Okay, I can tell you about my experience with Colt AR-15s and Daniel Defense AR-15s and
Surefire
suppressors.
Yeah.
Okay, I can't tell you what happens if you do other combinations, but I can tell you what happens with those combinations based on my experience is limited too. Everybody's is limited to a certain extent. So make sure you do your research. I made a note here that one place that we've done business with is Silencer Shop online. They've got a lot of stuff there, a lot of experienced people. Do your own research, but
they've really streamlined the process to purchase the firearm, which is one of the big reasons to go through them. Of course, there are other great options as well. That's just one example, but they have these kiosks where they've simplified immensely the process for going through the bureaucratic hoops.
Yeah. So I guess what I would do is suggest that you talk to real people who have actually used the products that you're interested in, not somebody that's just read about that particular product from somebody else. So talk to people that have really used the product, because there are lots of things that you might not know about, or people might not know about unless they've actually used it.
One thing I want to mention here real quickly, we skipped over, meant to mention it earlier, is there's this myth out there that basically says that if I have an NFA item, I give up my right to be free from unreasonable search or seizure, that basically I'm subject to search by the ATF or other government entities simply because I own an NFA item like a suppressor. That is false. Okay, it's a myth. All right. You do have to produce your tax stamp, potentially, if they request to see your tax stamp, but you do not give up your right to be free from unreasonable search or seizure.
Yeah, and I think that flows sometimes from the fact that the FFLs that deal in this are subject to periodic inspections of paperwork and other things, guns from the ATF. But everything else being the same, you're not giving up your Fourth Amendment rights to anything as a result of owning an NFA item.
Yeah, exactly. Now, we think the NFA is unconstitutional, but there's no Fourth Amendment implication other than having to produce the tax stamp itself.
Yeah. And, one thing I want to mention at this juncture, we talked about maybe buying one, the NFA, going through all those hoops, things you might want to consider. But even after you get it, keep in mind there an NFA item in particular. I mean, for instance, a short barreled rifle, you have to ask permission from the ATF and file a form to be able to travel across state lines. Now, that's not the case with respect to a suppressor. At least right now, today. If you change your residence, move, you don't absolutely have to let them know with respect to a suppressor. They suggest that you do that. I think it's a form 53. I wrote it down, 5320.20. But you would have to let the ATF know if you were, a short-barreled shotgun rifle or other NFA items. So make sure you understand kind of the nuances of what you can do or can't do with the suppressor. Who can handle it? Can I just give your suppressor to my buddy and let him take off with it? And the answer is no.
It's going to depend. But for instance, there are lots of circumstances where, for instance, if you have a trust set up, that's a different story, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there are nuances, but you want to make sure you're aware of those before you just start being cavalier about your handling of these NFA items.
Yeah, in the future. And like I said, we mentioned the gun trust thing. That may be something you want to think about as well. Yeah. And last, like I said, make sure you understand your state law. Some states, for instance, I think a suppressor for hunting is great. It creates that situational awareness is better. It doesn't disturb anybody. But there are some states where you cannot hunt with a suppressor. And I think probably the reason that is the government's out there to do the gotcha, and they want to catch somebody because they shot a squirrel on the wrong day. So anyway.
Yeah, squirrel police.
Yeah, the squirrel police. So anyway, sorry, no offense. Well, yeah, I did mean offense.
Yeah, we did. We meant it.
We did.
We meant it.
So sorry. It offended you too much, but it should offend you a little.
Okay, so I hope this episode gives people a better idea. Like I said, there's lots of nuance to it, lots of considerations, but there's lots of homework to do if you're interested in these items. We just hope you got a better idea about the sorts of things you should consider and the sorts of things you should look for. As always, I will link to a lot of the resources that we talked about in the show notes. The other thing I want to mention, and Mike, I think you're going to have another question of the week, a little trivia question for people to think about. But the other thing I want to mention before we close up is the Supreme Court recently heard an oral argument on what's called the Loper-Bright case, which is challenging this doctrine called Chevron deference, Chevron Doctrine, which basically gives authority to administrative agencies to make reasonable interpretations of the law, and that the courts should defer to that reasonable interpretation. Now, this doctrine has been in place for quite some time, but it has gotten way out of control. I think it was flawed to begin with, and it's these agencies, as you might imagine, have taken advantage. You give an inch. The old saying, "You give an inch, they take a mile." That's exactly what these administrative agencies have done with this Chevron deference. They've taken way more than a mile from an inch. And so agencies, you think about any alphabet soup agency, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the FDA, the EPA, et cetera. Well, this Loper-Bright case actually involves something that's got nothing to do with firearms, really. It's a fishing. It's a case involving fishing and the regulation of fishing vessels. But the court heard argument, and it seems likely that the Supreme Court is going to either do away with Chevron Doctrine or at least significantly curtail Chevron Doctrine. Because, sorry, Mike, I'll finish up here real quick, and I'll let you chime in. The big problem with this doctrine is that it creates a significant violation of the separation of powers. Remember, our federal government was founded on the idea that we would have specific enumerated powers and that there would be three branches of government, and only three. There would be the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative branches. And what this Chevron doctrine does is it basically allows these executive branch agencies to take all three positions. They They get to interpret the law and basically make new law through their interpretations and their rulemaking authority. They also get to enforce it, which is what generally the job of the executive branch agency is. And the judiciary defers to them with respect to the interpretation of the law. So they are basically these agencies. This fourth branch of government, essentially, has usurped the power of the other three.
And become kings, little mini kingdoms. And it's interesting in this case, like you said, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
No, I'm done.
It's a fishing case. And I'm not an expert on, some people think I'm not an expert on anything, but I'm certainly not an expert on fishing regulation. But evidently what happened in this case is the government I think this was NOAA, actually, National Oceanic and something, whatever alphabet. So
Yeah.
you can figure that one out. What they were doing is they could put monitors on these commercial fishing ships. And I guess the law allowed them to put them on ships that were of a certain size, maybe, and the company that owned the ship had to pay for them. Well, there's these smaller ships out there, and I guess all historically, the law was that if you want to put monitors on my ship, then that's fine. You put the federal monitors on there and make sure I'm not catching the wrong fish or too many fish or whatever. But I'm not paying for this federal bureaucrat to have his clipboard or her clipboard and go, oh, you caught the right kind of fish today. Well, I guess the government, despite the fact that they seem to infinitely print money and make it out of nothing, ran out of money. NOAA did to pay for these monitors. So what they decided to do is they changed the law. And instead of these monitors being put on these ships for at government expense, and I understand it's like $700 a day.
And to be clear, Congress did not change the law.
Congress didn't.
Yeah, the federal bureaucracy, the federal agency.
So it's going to cost me $700 a day to pay for this government bureaucrat. By the way, it certainly seems like government bureaucrats the job to have anymore in the world. Mm-hmm. But anyway, these government bureaucrats are going to be put on these boats, and the boat owner or the fisherman were going to have to pay to be monitored by this federal bureaucrat to make sure they were catching the right fish or the right quantity of fish, whatever. Well, these folks have the federal agency just decided to change the rules midstream and require this, and they've been called on it. And Loper has filed suit, and it's gotten to the United States Supreme Court. And like Alex said,
we don't have the money to enforce our own laws, so we're going to make you pay for it.
Yeah. It's crazy. Yeah. It's crazy. That's my legal opinion. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what the decision will say from the Supreme Court. Yeah. But anyway, our hope is that, this is a case, if you look at the facts, you do say this is crazy. And this is government gone rogue. And we're hoping that the Supreme Court steps in and says, listen, we need to rein in these administrative agencies. And I'm all for reining in administrative agencies all over the federal and state court level and state government level. But with respect to this podcast, we think it'll help rein in the ATF and some of these other organizations that regulate firearms as well, because the legal analysis with respect to whether agency action is appropriate will apply no matter if you're the National Marine Fisheries Service or the ATF.
Yeah. And I'll likely talk about this case on my Friday, Saturday episode. I've been releasing them Saturday by noon in recent weeks, but this is a more broadly freedom-related topic versus a Monday gun day topic. But it does have implications, like you said, for the gun law and our right to keep and bear arms, because hopefully it serves to rein in all federal government agencies, including the ATF.
Yeah, I think this will have a greater positive impact if we go the way we think it will go and the way we hope it goes for the gun community, for instance, than maybe even a decision where the courts say, hey, what the ATF did with pistol braces was wrong, because that decision may be simply based upon their lack of compliance with the Administrative Procedures Act, and they may get another shot at it. So we think this case here, in my eyes, has a much greater chance of increasing freedom in this country than some other cases that we watch that are very gun specific.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll link to there's a SCOTUS blog article about the case. I haven't listened to the oral argument yet. I think it was over 3 hours. But interestingly, the case was argued by Paul Clement, who also argued the Bruen case. So it should be an interesting. He's very talented very experienced at the Supreme Court, and hopefully we get a favorable decision from the Supreme Court on this case. I think that we will, but it only time will tell. So
and time will be end of June, probably,
right,
of this year.
Right. So just a few months away, which is short in the Supreme Court world. So the wheels of justice certainly turn slowly. But I'll likely talk about this in a future episode, on a Saturday episode. So keep an eye out for that. I'll listen to the oral argument and share my thoughts with you about it, and then we'll talk about it more after the Supreme Court issues their decision, of course. So with that said, Mike, anything else you want to mention? I know you've got the trivia question ready there, so you want to talk about that, and then we'll close up the show.
Sure. So the question for next week is not going to be just like A or B. Here's the question. The four components of a pistol cartridge are, actually be any cartridge, the four components of a cartridge are, and I'm going to give you one of them because this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. People pull cartridges out of a box and they load them in their magazine, not their clip. They load them in their magazine and they say, I need to put bullets in my magazine. Well, they're putting cartridges in their magazine. And one of the components of a cartridge is a bullet. So what are the other three components of a cartridge?
Okay.
And that kind of emphasizes the correct nomenclature of a bullet versus a cartridge. And then we'll find out what the components of a cartridge are. And you can look it up and do your, what's the AI thing?
The one you use?
Well, I use Perplexity.
Yeah.
Which is much smarter than I am.
Chat GPT or Bard. Yeah. There's lots of different AI mechanisms out there now. But anyway, so what are the components of a cartridge?
Mm-hmm. One of the four is a bullet. What are the other three?
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you learned a little something about Constitution, constitutional history, the NFA, the National Firearms Act of 1934, and suppressors and what you need to know when purchasing a suppressor. Like I said, we will likely talk about the benefits of an NFA trust in a future episode, and also keep an eye out for my discussion about the Loper-Bright case and this Chevron Doctrine. Of course, you can always find our content on forgeoffreedom.com. I link to all the podcasts there, the audio version and the video version, along with all of the show notes, which have, of course, lots of links and a summary of the topics, as well as chapters to each episode. So you might find that useful. So forgeoffreedom.com. You can also find the content on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and just about any popular podcast streaming platform. As always, if you like the show, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. It also helps if you leave us a review on Apple or Spotify to let them know that this is a podcast worth listening to. As always, thanks for your support. And until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter @ForgeOfFreedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.